What are you going to do when you get lonely? What are you going to do when there's no one standing by your side? You have been running much too long. You know, it is just your foolish pride. So screams Eric Clapton in his 1971 iconic song, Layla. I have a question for you. How many of you have suffered the pain of an unrequited love? How many of you have loved someone so bad it hurts and to not be able to realize that love or even to express it? How many of you have denied someone the ability to love you? If you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry. You will someday. After reading Eric Clapton's autobiography, after reading The Love You Make, The Insider Story of the Beatles by Peter Brown, and many, many articles by Rolling Stone, the story of Layla is a story of obstacles. The obstacle that stands in the way of love. The obstacle being someone who cannot express their love. The story of Layla is not only a story of a great song, but a story of creation. After researching all of those great resources, I can share with you the story of Layla. It's written by Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton was born in 1945 in England, and he is a very introverted, shy, sensitive kid who finds the only way that he can express himself is through the blues music of the American black bluesmen. He spends as many hours as he can in his room learning the blues of Robert Johnson. By the age of 19, there is graffiti all over London proclaiming Clapton is God. He managed to take his spirit and focus it and direct it into a guitar and express his love for the world and his pain and his longing and his dreams. First with the Yardbirds, then with John Mayall's Blues Breakers. He also forms a supergroup called Cream. And while he's with Cream, he becomes close friends with a man named George Harrison. George Harrison was the guitarist of the Beatles. Eric and George formed a close bond, a close friendship. George had a wife. His wife was Pattie Boyd. Pattie Boyd Harrison, once they got married. Now, Pattie Boyd Harrison, a former model, can claim to she can claim to be the muse to several iconic songs, the first of which is Something, that George Harrison wrote for her. Something in the way she moves makes me love her. That is George Harrison's ode to his wife, a statement of his devotion to her. Now, while he's writing this, Pattie Boyd and George Harrison are having difficulties, the same difficulties that all married couples do. And where does she go for help? She goes to George Harrison's best friend, Eric Clapton. And they don't have a romantic affair. They have what's called an emotional affair, where she pours out her heart to him. Later on in Layla, George Harrison would write, "When your old man left you, I gave you consultation. Rather, I gave you consultation when your old man left you down. And like a fool, I fell in love with you." And that is exactly what Eric did. He fell in love with Pattie. And one night, he and Pattie were walking hand in hand. And that's all they had ever done. They had never expressed their love to each other. But they had this bond of support and mutual respect. George and Eric had a bromance, a true love affair between men, a platonic, non-sexual love affair. And there's no way that Eric could betray his friend George by expressing his love for George's wife, Pattie. And Pattie felt devoted to George, and there's no way that she would cheat on George. But one night, George had left their house, Pattie and George's house, drinking. Patty called Eric over and asked for consolation and support. And they went out for a walk, and they're holding hands on a foggy night. George Harrison comes back, and he sees his best friend and his wife walking hand in hand. He gets out of his car, and he confronts Eric. And George Harrison was a street fighter. And he gets in Eric's face, and he says, "What are you doing? This is my wife." And he says to his wife, "You've got to make a choice right now, Patty, me or him." And Patty chooses George, her husband. Eric descends into intense drug abuse. He is destroyed by the fact that the love of his life has chosen her husband, which is probably the right thing at that time. He and Eric still record music together, and he can't fully express the love that he has for Patty. In 1970, he goes to Florida, and he gathers a bunch of studio musicians, among them Jim Gordon, who was an amazing drummer. He had been a session drummer, drummed for Gordon Lightfoot, drummed for Steely Dan. Jim Gordon had just ended a relationship with Rita Coolidge and was obsessed with her, and was working on a song about his obsession with Rita Coolidge. Eric Clapton needed to find a way to bring all of these feelings and these raw emotions out in music. And so he got his friends, Jim Gordon among them, Carl Radle and Bobby Whitlock, and he formed a group called Derek and the Dominoes so they could be somewhat anonymous. He brought in his friend Duane Allman from the Allman Brothers, who played a mean slide guitar. And he wrote a series of songs all about expressing his love for Patty, but he couldn't call her Patty. Because if he calls her Patty, then the whole world knows that he's in love with George Harrison's wife. And so he renames the song Patty, he renames it Layla, after a 16th century Persian love poem. And he calls it Layla. And in the song, he screams at the top of his lungs, "I'm begging, darling, please. I'm on my knees." You can hear his guitar wail, and he gets his friend Duane Allman to scream and to cry. He hopes and he prays that Patty hears this song and she will leave George and come to him, and they will live happily ever after. Jim Gordon, the drummer, also has a song devoted to his love, Rita. And it's a slower song. It is piano. Jim Gordon can not only play the drums brilliantly, but he could also play the piano. He proposed this song to be part of the album, and Eric said, "I got an idea. Let's merge our songs together." The first part of the song will be my screaming ode to Patty, where I'm screaming, "Layla, you got me on my knees. Layla, I'm begging, darling, please." And he says, we'll reach a crescendo. And when we hit that crescendo, Jim, you hit it on the piano. So when you're listening to the song, you'll hear that great crescendo of the screaming, crying guitars, where Eric's heart is ripped open and bleeding, pure music. And then it hits that crescendo, and then bam, it explodes. And Jim Gordon brings in that gentle, flowing piano, and then leads us out. The story of Layla is not only amazing for the story the song tells, but the story of its creation. To find out what happened to Eric and Patty, you're going to have to do your own research. You're going to find out what happened to Jim Gordon. It's not a good story. You're going to have to do your own research. If you don't have Layla on your playlist now,